Somewhere beneath the streets of London, in a basement corridor of the British Museum that most visitors never see, there is a room where the air is kept at a precise temperature and the light is deliberately low. The shelves run floor to ceiling. The objects on those shelves are small, palm-sized in many cases, and they are made of baked clay the colour of old sand. Some are cracked, some are whole. Some are fragments no larger than a thumbnail, sealed inside padded trays with catalogue numbers inked in careful script along their edges. They sit there in the quiet, and they have been sitting somewhere, in the ground, in a palace archive, in a museum collection, for anywhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years. Most of them have never been translated, but the ones that have, and there are thousands of those too, contain something that has troubled scholars since the 19th century, though the nature of the trouble has shifted depending on who is doing the reading. What those translated tablets describe, taken collectively across multiple centuries and multiple civilizations, is a world in which great divine powers were once present on Earth, physically present, administratively present, issuing decisions and governing from specific locations with specific names, and then were not displaced by mythology, not reinterpreted by later theology, simply gone, departed. The texts that describe their leaving are not triumphant, they are not relieved, they are in many cases desperate. In 1872, a young self-taught scholar named George Smith sat in this same institution and read a clay tablet he had retrieved from a delivery of fragments excavated at Nineveh from the ruins of a palace library that had burned to the ground in 612 BC. The tablet, catalogue number K3375, now housed in room 55 of the British Museum, described a flood. It described gods arguing over whether to send it. It described those gods in a passage that stopped Smith cold, crouching against a city wall afterward, trembling, described as having gathered like flies around a sacrifice, weeping for what they had caused. These were not triumphant gods. These were gods behaving like beings who had lost something and did not entirely know how to bear it. Smith reportedly left the building, went into the street, and began removing his clothing. Whether this is legend or documented fact depends on who you ask, but the point is that the tablet shook something loose in him, not because it paralleled the biblical flood, though it did, and that was already extraordinary, but because of what the gods in the story did next. They did not return to what they had been before. Something changed. The text implies a settlement, a new arrangement, a boundary placed between the world of divine presence and the world of human habitation that had not existed before the waters rose. Tonight, or this morning, or this quiet afternoon, wherever you are and whatever the hour when you find yourself here, that question is what we are going to sit with. Not the flood itself, but what the flood marks. Not the creation of humanity, but what the text suggests happened to the creators afterward. Across a dozen separate cuneiform sources, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and even the records of civilizations that learned from Mesopotamia, absorbed its gods into their own religious vocabulary, and called those ancient powers by older and stranger names, a pattern emerges. It is not dramatic, it is not loud, but it is consistent, and consistency in ancient sources is the closest thing we have to a signal. Take a breath, let your body settle wherever you found rest tonight. Something happened to the Anunnaki. The clay remembers what it was. Let us read it carefully together and decide for ourselves what it means. If you feel comfortable, leave a note somewhere, a comment, a word, about where you're listening from tonight, not because it changes anything in the record, but because the clay tablets themselves were records of presence, of people in specific places, in specific moments, noting what they knew. That tradition is older than writing. It might be worth keeping. The tablet is cold in the hand. The catalogue number is ink on a small white label. The content is 4,000 years old and has not finished speaking. The world before the silence. Before we can understand what the texts say about the Anunnaki leaving, we need to understand what they say about the Anunnaki being here. And for that, we need to begin not with the gods, but with the land. the specific physical alluvial geography that produced the civilization that wrote these things down. The region that the ancient Greeks would eventually call Mesopotamia, a word meaning simply the land between the rivers, occupies what is today southern Iraq, a flat and featureless plain threaded by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers as they move toward the Persian Gulf. By the time the rivers reach this region from their origins in the Anatolian highlands, they carry enormous quantities of silt, and over millennia they have deposited that silt in layers across the plain, creating some of the most fertile agricultural land on the surface of the ancient earth. What they did not create was stone. The southern Mesopotamian plain has almost no stone, no timber to speak of, no metal. What it has is clay and water and the agriculture that water makes possible. Everything the civilization of Sumer built, every archive, every monument, every administrative record, was built with these three things. The Sumerians, as we now call them, were present in this region by at least 5000 BCE. The city of Eridu, their oldest, according to both the archaeological record and their own texts, shows continuous occupation from around 5400 BC through the 3rd millennium BC. By the late 4th millennium, the city of Uruk had become what scholars now describe as the world's first true city, with a population that may have reached 50,000 at its peak, a monumental temple complex, a functioning system of long-distance trade, and, crucially, a system of recording information in clay that would become, within a few centuries, the world's first writing. The Sumerians did not call themselves Sumerians. They called their land Ki-Engir, the land of civilized lords, and they called their language Emegir, the noble tongue. Their civilization was not, by their own account, something they had built from nothing. It was something they had been given. This is a distinction the texts make consistently and with considerable specificity. The word me, pronounced approximately may, appears hundreds of times across Sumerian literature. It refers to what scholars variously translate as divine ordinances, cosmic powers, or the arts of civilization. The me include writing, kingship, music, lawcraft, the descent into the underworld, the ascent from the underworld, truth, the administration of cities, the building of temples, the practice of medicine, the craft of the smith, the art of war. They are not human inventions in the Sumerian framework. They are divine properties held originally by specific gods and transmitted to humanity at specific moments in textual time. The goddess Inanna, in a long Sumerian poem preserved in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature under catalogue number ECSL 1.3.1, travels to the Abzu, the underground freshwater realm of the god Enki, gets him drunk on beer, and receives the me as gifts, carrying them back to her city of Uruk in her boat of heaven. The poem lists over 100 of these powers, one after another, in careful sequence. Enki, sobering up and realizing what he has given away, sends demons to retrieve them. He fails. The me belong to Uruk now. The point is not whether this story is literally true. The point is what it says about how the Sumerians understood the origin of what made their civilization function. These things came from somewhere else. They were held by beings they called the Anunnaki before they were held by humans. They were transferred, whether willingly or by cunning, from a divine context to a human one. And the transfer, in the texts, is always a story of proximity, of beings who were close enough to steal from, close enough to receive gifts from, close enough to encounter at a beer table in a sacred underwater palace. The word Anunnaki itself, written in Sumerian as transliterated as Nunna or Anunnaki 4 Ne, is derived from An, the Sumerian god of the sky. The name is generally translated by scholars as princely offspring or royal seed, meaning the offspring of An and the earth goddess Ki. The scholar Jeremy Black, in his authoritative Gods, Demons and Symbols of Ancient Mesopotamia 1992, notes that the earliest usages of the term come from the reign of Gudea of Lagash around 2144, 2124 BCE, and the subsequent Third Dynasty of Ur. In those earliest appearances, the Anunnaki are the highest gods of the Sumerian pantheon, the descendants of the sky god, the beings who decree the fates of mankind. The composition known as Enki and the World Order, a 472-line Sumerian text preserved on multiple tablets from the Great Excavation of Nippur, which the University of Pennsylvania conducted between 1888 and 1900 under the direction of John P. Peters, Herman Hilprecht, and the photographer-explorer John Henry Haynes, is perhaps the most detailed portrait we have of what Anunnaki presence on Earth actually looked like in the textual record. In this poem, Enki sails through the known world, blessing city after city, assigning divine responsibilities to rivers, fields, bricklayers, farmers and governors. And in a passage that has drawn scholarly attention, precisely because of its matter-of-fact tone, the text states that the Anunnaki do homage to Enki, sing hymns in his honour, and in the phrase that the scholar Samuel Noah Kramer, in his foundational 1963 work The Sumerians, found most striking, take up their dwellings among the people of Sumer. The same text twice states that the Anunnaki decree the fates of mankind. This is not a description of gods who exist only in heaven, only in theological abstraction, only in the smoke of ritual offerings. This is a description of beings with dwellings, specific dwellings, among specific people, in specific cities, with specific names and specific functions in the administration of those cities. Every major Sumerian deity was understood to be the patron of a specific city and was believed to reside within that city's temple. One text mentions as many as 50 Anunnaki associated with the city of Eridu alone. They were not distant, they were resident. And residence, as anyone who has ever left a place knows, implies the possibility of departure. The excavations at Nippur that recovered the tablets bearing Enki and the World Order were the first American excavation in the ancient Near East, and they were extraordinary in scale. The site at Nippur, modern Nafar in southern Iraq, had been the religious centre of Mesopotamia for thousands of years. It was the city of Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon, whose temple complex, the Ekur, meaning mountain house, served as what the Sumerians understood to be the literal dwelling place of the divine assembly. John Henry Haynes, photographing the excavation in 1893, documented the recovery of approximately 23,000 tablets from the temple library alone. The majority remain only partially published. The ones that have been published contain, with quiet consistency, the same essential picture: a world in which divine powers were present, active, administratively embedded, and then gradually, then suddenly, then completely were not. The question the evidence raises is not whether this transition happened in the texts. It clearly did. The question is what the texts say about why. The first fracture, when the gods grew tired. The oldest detailed account of instability within the divine order, the first crack in what the texts otherwise present as an eternal arrangement, is not a war. It is a labour dispute. The Atrahasis epic is an Akkadian composition dated to approximately 1700 BCE in its oldest surviving form, though scholars including W.G. Lambert and A.R. Millard, whose landmark 1969 edition Atrahasis, The Babylonian Story of the Flood, remains the standard critical text, argue that it draws on much older Sumerian sources. Three main tablets of the composition housed in the British Museum under accession numbers 89 Nal, 426.234, 1889 Nal, 426.236, catalogue numbers BM 78941, BM 78943 respectively, recovered from the site of ancient Sippar and donated to the museum in 1889. They are old Babylonian tablets, baked clay inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, and they open not with the creation of the world, but with an explanation of why the creation of humanity was considered necessary. The text begins in a time before human beings existed. In this time, the work of maintaining the world, digging the rivers, dredging the canals, levelling the fields, building the irrigation infrastructure on which all Mesopotamian agriculture depended, fell to the Igigi, a class of younger, lesser divine beings who laboured under the authority of Anunnaki. The Atrahasis epic is specific about this arrangement, and specific about the timescale The Igigi had been working for 3,600 years when they reached their breaking point. The text reads, in the Lambert and Millard translation, when the gods were man, they did forced labour, they bore drudgery. The word translated as forced labour is the Akkadian ilko, which in the administrative vocabulary of Mesopotamian civilization referred specifically to obligatory service performed for a superior authority, service that could be demanded, that carried penalties for refusal, and that was experienced not as devotion, but as burden. The Igigi, according to the text, dug the Tigris, dug the Euphrates, dug the great canals. They worked through the night. They counted the years. And after 3,600 of them, they set down their tools. The tablet describes what followed with unusual narrative vividness. The Igigi set fire to their tools. They marched to the gate of Enlil's dwelling in the night. They surrounded the great house. Enlil, hearing the commotion, asked his vizier Nusku what was happening. Nusku looked out and reported, "Father, the gods are at war. They have surrounded your house." The language the text uses here is striking in its precision. The Igigi do not ask for better conditions. They do not negotiate. They refuse outright, and in their refusal they articulate a grievance that the text treats as legitimate. The work was too heavy, the toil too great, and the labour had simply broken them. Enlil, faced with a rebellion he cannot suppress, calls the full assembly of the Anunnaki and Enlil himself, Enki and Ninhursag, to address the crisis. And it is here that the text takes its most consequential turn. Enki, described throughout Sumerian and Akkadian literature as the god of wisdom, craft, and the underground freshwater, proposes a solution. He will create a new being to take over the work. He will fashion, from clay mixed with the flesh and blood of a slain divine being, a creature capable of bearing the ilko, the forced labour, on behalf of the gods. The creature will be called Lulu, primitive or original human. Its purpose, stated plainly in the text, is to relieve the Igigi of work so that the gods can rest. Mainstream scholarship reads this passage as a mythological explanation for the human condition, a story that accounts for why human beings work, why labour is difficult, why life is not effortless. The scholar Thorkild Jacobson, in his 1976 work The Treasures of Darkness, frames the Atrahasis creation narrative as reflecting Mesopotamian agricultural theology, in which the maintenance of the irrigation system was understood as a cosmic as well as a practical responsibility, and the creation of humanity was the divine solution to a logistical problem. This reading is well supported by the text and has considerable scholarly consensus behind it. But there are specific elements of the Atrahasis account that this reading does not entirely address. The first is the nature of the Igigi rebellion itself. The text does not describe the Igigi as theologically inferior beings who simply needed to be managed more effectively. It describes them as genuinely exhausted, as beings who had reached a physical and psychological limit after 3,600 years of unceasing labour. The language of the text is not bureaucratic, it is visceral. They burned their tools. They surrounded the house in the dark. Whatever is being described here is not a theological abstraction. It reads like a memory. The second element is the speed and completeness with which Enlil accepts the necessity of creating humans. He does not attempt to negotiate with the Igigi, to redistribute labour, or to reduce the workload by other means. He agrees immediately that the work must be done, and that if the Igigi cannot do it, someone else must. The maintenance of the physical world, the rivers, the fields, the canals, is apparently not optional. It must continue regardless of who performs it. What the Atrahasis account establishes, for the purposes of the larger pattern we are tracing, is this. The relationship between the Anunnaki and the world they administered was not effortless. It was work. It required labour, infrastructure, ongoing maintenance, and, crucially, a workforce capable of sustaining that maintenance over very long periods of time. And within that relationship, as the text makes clear, conflict was possible. The divine order was not immune to fracture. The Igigi had already broken once. The question the later texts will quietly ask is whether the Anunnaki themselves eventually reached the same point of exhaustion, or whether something else entirely drove them from the world they had built. The Labour Rebellion is contained in the Atrahasis narrative. Humans are created, the work continues. But the creation of humans does not resolve the underlying tension between the divine administrative class and the world they are responsible for. 3 times in the epic, Enlil attempts to reduce humanity's numbers, first by plague, then by famine, then by flood. 3 times, Enki warns a single human, Atrahasis himself, exceedingly wise, to build a vessel, to preserve the seed of living things. The flood is survived. The arrangement continues, but not without cost, and not without something changing in the way the gods relate to the world they have created. What that something was, the next layers of the textual record will attempt to define. 7 who decree the architecture of divine authority. Before we can understand the significance of the Anunnaki's departure from the texts, their gradual withdrawal from earthly administration into the underworld, into silence, into what the later Hurro-Hittite tradition would call simply the former gods, we need to understand precisely what kind of authority they exercised when they were present, because the nature of a departure is inseparable from the nature of what left. The Sumerian concept that most directly describes Anunnaki authority is the me, which we encountered briefly in the previous section. But there is a second concept, equally important and considerably less discussed in popular treatments of Mesopotamian religion, which is Namtar, literally decreed fate, and the assembly through which fate was decreed, known in Sumerian as the Purim or Divine Council. Understanding this institution is essential to understanding what in the textual record is described as breaking down. The Purim was not a metaphor. The texts describe it as a functioning, deliberative body that met to make decisions affecting the cosmos, humanity, and the structure of time. It had a specific membership, the great gods who held the power of decision, and a specific hierarchy with An at its head, and Enlil as its executive officer. Decisions made by the Purim were considered binding in the same way that royal decrees issued from the Sumerian Egal, the Great House, were binding on human populations. The scholar Samuel Noah Kramer, writing in the Sumerians, Their History, Culture and Character, University of Chicago Press, 1963, noted that the Sumerian political assembly appears to have served as a literal human parallel to the Divine Council, what Kramer called the most significant contribution of Sumer to political thought and practice. The gods governed by assembly, and humans, observing this, adopted the same form for their own governance. The Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian creation epic, composed in its canonical form around the 12th century BC, but drawing on much older Sumerian material, provides the most elaborate surviving description of the Purim in operation. The principal tablets of the Enuma Elish were recovered from Ashurbanipal's great library at Nineveh, the same library that yielded K3375, and they are housed in the British Museum in the K series of Kunjik tablets. The epic 6th tablet is particularly relevant to the question of Anunnaki authority because it describes what happened to that authority after Marduk, the champion of the younger gods in their war against the primordial waters of Tiamat, had defeated the Chaos Force and reshaped the cosmos. Having won the right to restructure the divine order, Marduk does something specific. He assigns the Anunnaki to their stations. The text of Tablet 6 reads, in the translation provided by Stephanie Daly in Myths from Mesopotamia, Oxford University Press, 1989, Marduk assigned the Anunnaki their positions. He separates them into 2 groups, 300 to watch over the sky, 300 to watch over the earth and the underworld. He gives them the Esagila temple as their dwelling. He sets their food portions. And in a passage that has attracted considerable scholarly comment, the Anunnaki build Marduk a great temple in gratitude, then receive from him what the text calls the 50 names. a sequence of titles that encode in compressed form the entire range of divine authority that Marduk is now distributing among the assembled gods. What is significant here, for our purposes, is that the Enuma Elish presents the Anunnaki's cosmological authority as something that was assigned, delegated from a higher authority rather than inherent. And what is delegated can be restructured. Marduk assigns 300 to the sky and 300 to the underworld. The division is architecturally neat in a way that the older Sumerian texts, where the Anunnaki simply take up their dwellings among the people, are not. Something has happened between the older Sumerian picture and the Babylonian one. The Anunnaki have been organized. Their presence on Earth has been formalized into a cosmic assignment. They hold specific stations, and the holding of a station implies, as the later texts will show with increasing clarity, the possibility of abandoning it. The concept of me reinforces this reading. In the composition Inanna and the Me, Ixil 1.3.1, as noted earlier, Inanna receives the Me from Enki and carries them to Uruk. But the Me themselves, in the long list provided by the poem, are not natural phenomena. They are administrative technologies. The descent into the underworld, the ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the kiss of the phallus, the art of prostitution, the art of forthright speech, the art of slanderous speech, the art of adorning, the loosening of hair, the kindling of fire, the extinguishing of fire, the hard work of the smith, the carrying of the leather worker's bag. They are, in other words, the full range of capabilities required to run a civilization. Every one of them appears in the list. Every one of them was understood by the Sumerians to have originated with a divine being before it was given to or taken by humanity. The scholar Bent Auster, in his studies of Sumerian wisdom literature, has argued that the Me represent a kind of civilizational operating system, the sum of the knowledge and practices required to maintain an advanced society. If the Anunnaki were the original holders of the Me, and if the Me represents something like a complete set of administrative tools for running a complex civilization, then the transfer of the Me to humanity takes on a different coloration. It looks less like a gift and more like a handover, a succession, the delegation of authority from those who originally held it to those who would maintain it in their absence. This reading is speculative. No mainstream scholar of Sumerology would frame the Me transfer in these terms. But the pattern it suggests, divine beings with specific administrative functions, those functions being systematically transferred to human hands, the divine beings then becoming less present in the textual record, is not manufactured. It is observable in the sequence of the texts themselves, moving from the 3rd to the 2nd to the 1st millennium BC. And the question it raises, why would the original holders of these powers transfer them unless they were preparing to leave, is one the later texts address with unexpected directness, the flood tablet, and what the gods said when the waters rose. On December 3rd, 1872, George Smith read aloud to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London a translation of a cuneiform tablet that had been sitting in the British Museum's collection for almost a decade unidentified amid thousands of similar fragments. The text described a man warned by a god to build a boat. It described a flood that covered the mountains. It described a bird sent out over the waters and returning, finding no land. The room was reportedly stunned. William Ewart Gladstone, then a Member of Parliament and soon to be Prime Minister, was present and understood immediately what Smith had found, a story older than Genesis that contained the same events. The tablet was K3375. It is the 11th tablet of the standard Babylonian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, recovered from the ruins of Ashurbanipal's palace library at Nineveh, which burned when the Assyrian Empire fell in 612 BC. The fire that destroyed the library paradoxically preserved its contents. The heat baked the unfired clay tablets harder and sealed the cuneiform impressions more durably than time alone would have done. K3375 was inscribed sometime in the 7th century BC, but the text it carries is considerably older, the standard Babylonian version of Gilgamesh was composed around 1200 BC, and the flood narrative it contains draws on sources including the Atra-Hasis epic that predate it by 5 centuries. For our purposes, the flood narrative in Tablet She is not interesting because of its parallels with Genesis, as striking as those parallels are. It is interesting because of what it reveals about the behaviour of the gods during and immediately after the flood, specifically about how the Anunnaki are described in the moment when they witness what divine decision has caused. The relevant passage comes in the voice of Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of the flood, who is recounting the event to Gilgamesh. He describes the storm as it built. The Anunnaki raised their torches, lighting the land with their brightness. This image, the Anunnaki as the illuminating active force behind the flood's devastating storm, presents them as participants, not observers. But what follows is equally significant. When the flood reaches its full fury, Utnapishtim describes Ishtar, the great goddess, screaming from the walls of heaven. And then he says, in the Dali translation, the gods cowered like dogs, crouched against the outer wall. The Anunnaki, those same beings who held the Me, who decreed the fates of mankind, who took up their dwellings among the people of Sumer, they are hiding. They are frightened. They are, in the starkest possible terms, unable to face what their decision has produced. When the waters finally recede, and Utnapishtim emerges to offer a sacrifice, the text continues. The gods smelled the savour. The gods smelled the sweet savour. The gods crowded like flies around the sacrifice. And Ishtar lifts her lapis lazuli necklace, described as a gift from Anu, and swears that she will never forget the days of the flood. Then comes the crisis. Enlil arrives and sees that someone has survived. He is enraged. Has some living soul escaped? No man was to survive the destruction. Ea, Enki in his Akkadian name, responds in the text's most philosophically acute passage, essentially scolding Enlil for acting in anger rather than wisdom, arguing that the sinners could have been punished by targeted means without destroying the innocent. What scholars such as Thorkild Jacobson in The Treasures of Darkness, and more recently Andrew George in his landmark 2003 critical edition of the Epic of Gilgamesh, have noted about this scene is its remarkable moral complexity. The gods are not presented as omnipotent and just. They are presented as divided, frightened, regretful, and capable of being wrong. Enlil's rage and Ea's rebuke are not an anomaly in Mesopotamian theology, they are characteristic. The gods, in Mesopotamian literature, are not perfect beings. They are powerful beings, subject to the same passions, the same errors, the same consequences of poor judgment that afflict humanity. The flood was a mistake, or at least a decision whose full cost was not anticipated. The settlement that follows the flood, in Tablet C, is the part of the narrative that has received comparatively little attention in popular retellings, but is crucial to our investigation. Enlil, confronted with the survivor Utnapishtim and his wife, responds not by destroying them, but by elevating them. He touches their foreheads and says, in the Dali translation, "Hitherto Utnapishtim has been mortal. Now let Utnapishtim and his wife be like the gods, us. Let Utnapishtim dwell far away at the mouth of the rivers." The phrase "at the mouth of the rivers" refers to the edge of the known world, a threshold between the realm of human habitation and something beyond it. This elevation and relocation of the flood survivor, read as part of the larger textual pattern, suggests something about what the flood represents. In Mesopotamian cosmological thinking, it is not merely a catastrophe, it is a dividing line. Before the flood, in the Sumerian king list's framing, kingship and divine guidance are described in one way. After the flood, they are described in another. Before the flood, in the Atra-Hasis account, the gods and humans exist in a state of productive but troubled proximity. After the flood, the terms of that proximity are renegotiated. The flood is the moment at which the old arrangement ended and a new one began. And the new arrangement, as the later texts will make clear, involved increasingly less direct divine presence. The Anunnaki in Tablet C are still present. They are witnesses, participants, mourners. They cry at the destruction. They light the land with their torches. They hide behind the wall of heaven when the storm exceeds what they can endure. They are, in other words, beings with limitations, with regrets, with the capacity for fear. And something about the flood, about what the decision to send it cost the divine order, about the terms of the settlement that followed, appears to have initiated a recession that the subsequent centuries of texts will trace with increasing clarity. The Anunnaki, after Tablet C, are less and less present in the land. They do not disappear from the texts, but they change. They become judges rather than administrators, dwellers in the underworld rather than residents of cities, former gods rather than current ones. The flood did not end their presence, but it may have ended their era, the war that broke the order of heaven. There is a text in the British Museum that most people who discuss the Anunnaki have never read. It is not famous. It has no popular title. It is fragmentary, badly damaged. In the description of the scholar who published its most thorough modern analysis, and its lacunae, its gaps and missing sections, make it impossible to reconstruct with certainty. But what survives is, for the investigation we are conducting, among the most directly relevant passages in the entire Mesopotamian corpus. The text is a Neo-Assyrian tablet describing an armed conflict involving the Anunnaki themselves. It was published and analysed by Takayoshi Oshima in a 2010 study, and it describes a sequence of events that reads, with startling plainness, like a record of divine civil war. In the surviving portions of the text, Marduk, the national god of Babylon, principal deity of the Enuma Elish, the god whose elevation to supremacy over the divine pantheon is the central theological event of Babylonian religious history, leads his army of Anunnaki into the sacred city of Nippur. Nippur was not simply a city. It was the home of Enlil, the chief god of the older Sumerian pantheon, whose Ikur temple was understood as the literal seat of the assembly of the gods, the Purim. For Marduk to lead an armed force into Nippur was not merely a military act. It was a challenge to the fundamental architecture of divine authority. The text describes what happens next with considerable clarity despite its damage. The entry of Marduk's forces causes a disturbance, a cosmic disruption described as a flood, suggesting that the very act of divine conflict has physical consequences for the world it occurs within. The resident gods of Nippur, terrified, take refuge in the temple of Ninurta, the god of war, patron of Nippur, one of the older generation of divine powers. Enlil, the father of the gods, is enraged at Marduk's transgression and orders the gods of the Eshumesha temple, Ninurta's temple, to capture Marduk and the Anunnaki who march with him. The Anunnaki are captured. This is not metaphor. The text is explicit. They are taken prisoner, held by the forces of the older divine order. And then Marduk responds. He appoints a frontrunner named Mushteshirablim to lead a revolt. He sends his messenger to alert Nabu, the god of literacy and scribal arts, his own son, who speaks with such authority that the Eshumesha gods emerge from their temple to find him, leaving their position vulnerable. In the fighting that follows, Marduk defeats the gods of Eshumesha and takes 360 of them as prisoners of war. Among the captured is Enlil himself. Enlil protests, according to the text, that the gods of Eshumesha acted innocently, that they were drawn out of their temple by Nabu's words, and thus bear no guilt for the conflict. Marduk places them on trial before the assembled Anunnaki, and here the surviving text ends, or rather, here the damage becomes so extensive that continuous reading is no longer possible. What we have is a final warning, issued by Damkiana, another name for Ninhursag, the mother goddess, to both gods and humanity, explicitly pleading that this divine warfare must never be repeated. The existence of this text has not been widely absorbed into popular discussions of the Anunnaki, and even within scholarship it remains understudied relative to its implications. Mainstream Assyriology reads it reasonably as a mythological theological narrative encoding the political rivalry between the priestly establishments of Babylon and Nippur, a story that justified Marduk's supremacy over Enlil's by framing that supremacy as the outcome of a cosmic trial rather than mere political dominance. This is a sound reading, and it is probably correct as far as it goes. But what the mainstream reading does not easily account for is the specific detail that in Herzog's warning articulates, this must not happen again. The phrase, in the context of Mesopotamian religious literature, does not function as a simple narrative conclusion. Warning texts of this type, texts that end with explicit prohibitions against repeating a cosmic event, generally preserve a memory of a real crisis that had real consequences in the lived experience of the civilization that produced them. The Atrahasis flood narrative ends with divine agreements to never again destroy all of humanity. The lament for ends with petitions that its storm never recur. These are not generic literary closings. They are the textual form of traumatic memory, the articulation of an experience so destabilizing that the civilization that survived it felt compelled to inscribe the prohibition against repetition on clay that would last 4,000 years. What the Neo-Assyrian text suggests, read alongside the other sources in our investigation, is that at some point in the deep history of the Mesopotamian divine order, a war among the gods had occurred. Not a mythological battle between cosmic principles, but something more structural, more administrative, more consequential. A conflict that involved the Anunnaki as a body, that implicated the highest authorities in the divine council, that resulted in captures and trials and the displacement of older powers by newer ones. And that left behind it a world in which the terms of divine presence on earth were permanently altered. The scholar Stephanie Daly, in the introduction to her translation of the Poem of Error in Myths from Mesopotamia, notes that the Epic of Error was one of the most widely distributed texts in the ancient Near East. Copies have been found across Mesopotamia in contexts ranging from royal libraries to private households, from the Neo-Assyrian period through the Neo-Babylonian. An amulet quoting from the Error Epic, a Neo-Assyrian plaque now in the British Museum, was evidently used as a protective charm against plague and calamity. The text was not merely literature. It was a document that people carried with them, kept in their homes, used in moments of danger. Whatever it described, its civilization believed that knowing it, carrying it, repeating it, offered some form of protection. It described, among other things, what happens when the guardian of order leaves his station, Error's madness, and the god who could not stop. The Poem of Error, formerly the Epic of Error and Isum, is one of the strangest and most psychologically acute compositions in the entire Mesopotamian literary corpus. It was composed, according to a colophon preserved at the end of the poem, in a dream by the scribe Kabti Ilani Marduk, son of Dabibi, who claims that he did not alter a single line of what he received. This claim of divine revelation was not unusual in ancient Near Eastern literature. Scribes often framed their compositions as transcriptions of divine speech, but the Poem of Error carries a weight and a specificity that sets it apart from most such claims. The poem survives across multiple Neo-Assyrian tablets, including British Museum tablet K1282, which contains Book 5, lines 1 through 60 of the composition. It is dated paleographically to the 8th or 9th century BC, making it, as the scholar Benjamin Foster notes in Before the Muses, an anthology of Akkadian literature, 30-year edition, CDL Press, 2005, the latest major Akkadian composition before the tradition essentially ends, a valediction for, a tradition that had lasted 2,000 years. The poem begins with Error, the Akkadian god of plague, war and pestilence, lying restless in his dwelling. His weapons, 7 terrible beings called the Sebiti, warrior demons created by Anu and given to Error as his armory, urge him to action. They tell him he has grown soft, that he sleeps too much, that the world has grown contemptuous of his name. They tell him that the clamour of human habitations has grown too great for the gods to endure. They tell him they are bored, that their equipment is rusty, that cobwebs are spun over our field gear, and their arrows are bent out of true. The 7 are not asking for battle as theology, they are asking for it as the reliefs of beings whose purpose has become meaningless in the absence of the violence that defined them. Error, moved by the 7's speech, goes to Babylon to find Marduk, because Marduk, as the supreme deity, must be consulted before the existing order can be disrupted. And in the meeting that follows, the text does something remarkable. It gives Marduk a speech that is in many ways the most direct statement in all Mesopotamian literature about the relationship between divine presence, cosmic order, and what happens when that presence is interrupted. Marduk begins by saying, "Once, long ago indeed, I grew angry. Indeed, I left my dwelling and caused the deluge. When I left my dwelling, the regulation of heaven and earth disintegrated. The shaking of heaven meant the positions of the heavenly bodies changed, nor did I restore them. The quaking of netherworld meant the yield of the furrow diminished. The regulations of heaven and earth disintegrating meant underground water diminished, high water receded." This is an extraordinary passage. Marduk is not describing the flood as a weapon he wielded from a position of power. He is describing the flood as the consequence of his absence. When he left his dwelling, things fell apart, not because he destroyed them, but because the withdrawal of his presence meant the regulatory systems that maintained cosmic order ceased to function. The positions of the heavenly bodies changed. The underground water diminished. The furrow became unproductive. The language of regulation, maintenance, and administration is unmistakable. Marduk is describing himself as a kind of ongoing operational necessity without whom the systems he maintains immediately begin to fail. And then Error offers a deal. He says, "While Marduk is away, having his image restored, for that time I will govern and keep strong the regulation of heaven and earth. He will manage the Igigi gods. He will keep order in the depths. He will dispatch the demons to the underworld. He will stand guard." Noble Marduk heard him. The words which Error spoke pleased him. He rose from his dwelling, described as an inaccessible place, and set out for the dwelling of the Anunnaki. And the moment he arose, the Igigi gods were terrified and went up to heaven. The Anunnaki gods were frightened and went down to the pit of hell. The clamour of the peoples throughout the land was stilled. Ill winds rose. Bright daylight turned to gloom. The description of what Marduk's displacement produces is precisely the description of what the absence of divine regulatory presence produces in the world: darkness, fear, cosmic instability, and the withdrawal of all the lesser divine beings to the extremities of their designated realms. Error, of course, does not keep his promise. He does not stabilize the world in Marduk's absence. He unleashes the violence he has been storing since before the composition began. He sends the 7 against city after city. He incites war between peoples. He causes famines, plagues, civil conflicts. The text of tablets 3 and 4 of the poem of Error, portions not directly relevant to our current focus, but available in the Foster and Daly translations, describe the systematic destruction of civilized life across the Near East in terms that scholars have sometimes read as reflecting actual historical memories of the catastrophic late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC, which saw the near simultaneous destruction of most major civilizations in the eastern Mediterranean. Eventually, Isum, Error's herald, a gentler god who has been trying to moderate Error's violence throughout the poem, speaks to him. He says, "You have not spared the lord of the land, you have not spared the land," and Error's violence stops. The god is exhausted, or sated, or both. In Tablet 5, Error speaks a calming proclamation. He will now be generous. He will bless those who preserve his tablets. He will protect the city that honours his name. The destruction ends not because it is reversed, but because the God who caused it has spent himself. The poem ends, and this is significant for our investigation, not with Marduk triumphantly returned, the order restored, everything as it was. It ends with Error promising to be less violent in the future, and with a warning about the conditions under which the violence can return. The old order is not restored, it is managed. Marduk's station, once vacated, once filled by Error's chaos, does not appear to fully restabilise. The regulation of heaven and earth that Marduk described as dependent on his presence has been disrupted in ways that the conclusion of the poem does not entirely resolve. What the poem of Error encodes, whether as theology, as political commentary, as encoded history, or as some layered combination of all three, is a model for how divine withdrawal operates. The Guardian leaves. The systems the Guardian maintained immediately begin to fail. A lesser power fills the vacuum, but violently and incompletely. The Guardian eventually returns, but something in the relationship between divine presence and cosmic order has been permanently altered by the interruption. The world that exists after Error's violence is not the world that existed before Marduk's departure, and the text knows this. It does not pretend otherwise. The question it leaves open, the question that the lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and will address from an entirely different angle, is whether what Marduk left for a time is what the Anunnaki eventually left permanently, the cities the gods left behind. In the corpus of ancient Mesopotamian literature, there is a specific genre of composition that scholars call the Eshema or city lament, a formal poetic structure developed to mourn the destruction of a city and, crucially, to document the divine behaviour that preceded and caused that destruction. 5 principal city laments have survived, all dating from the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1900-1600 BC, all drawing on events clustered around the fall of the Third Dynasty of Ur in approximately 2004 BC. They are formal, liturgical compositions, not eyewitness accounts of chaos, but carefully structured theological documents, intended for performance in temple ritual, meant to be spoken by priests before the gods of the ruined cities, serving as both elegy and petition. They are also, once you sit with them, among the most haunting texts in the entire ancient record. The Lament for or more precisely, the Lamentation over the destruction of published in critical edition by Samuel Noah Kramer in 1940 as Volume 12 of the Oriental Institute's Assyriological Studies series, is preserved on multiple CBS series tablets in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. It is a composition of 11 songs totaling 436 lines, composed, as Kramer notes, sometime during the Isin-Lhasa period following the fall of and it opens with a passage that is so specifically architectural in its documentation of divine departure that it demands careful attention. The opening of the Lament for lists, city by city, the divine patrons who have abandoned their dwellings. Enlil has abandoned the shrine of Nippur. His wife Ninlil has abandoned the key Ninasena has abandoned the eagle Ma. Inanna has abandoned Uruk. Nunna has abandoned Urim. Suen has abandoned the Kishnu-Gal. Ningal has abandoned the Agrum-Kug. Enki has abandoned Eridu. The list continues through more than a dozen cities and their divine patrons, each departure described in identical terms, has abandoned and has let the breezes haunt his sheepfold. This is not the language of gods being defeated. This is the language of gods making a choice. The syntax is active. The verbs are volative. Each deity, one after another, abandons their dwelling. The breezes haunt the emptied sheepfolds, the sacred enclosures of the temples, because the divine residents are no longer there to fill them with their presence. The wind enters because the god has left. The text is precise about the sequence. Departure first, then vacancy, then wind. What is structurally remarkable about this passage is that the departures are simultaneous and total. Every major city in Sumer loses its divine patron in the same moment. This is not a single god retreating in defeat. This is a coordinated withdrawal across the entire civilized world of southern Mesopotamia. The texts that document it treat this as a unified event, as something that happened to all of Sumer at once, as though a decision had been made at the level of the full divine assembly to vacate. The fuller lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur, edited in its definitive form by the scholar Piotr Michalowski-Isenbrand's 1989, extends this picture considerably. Michalowski's edition, drawing on multiple tablet fragments from the Nippur excavations, presents a composition of unusual length and structural complexity in which the destruction of the Sumerian heartland is narrated from multiple perspectives, divine, human, and somewhere between the two. The goddess Ningal, patron of Ur and wife of the moon god Nanna, is given an extended speech in which she describes her attempts to prevent the city's destruction. She says, in the ECSL translation, "I shed my tears before An. I myself made supplication to Enlil. Let not my city be destroyed, I implored them. Let not Urim be destroyed, I implored them. Let not its people perish, I implored them." But An did not change that word. Enlil did not soothe my heart with an "it is good, so be it." She returned a second time to the council of the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki had seated themselves to ratify decisions, the text says, and again petitioned. Again, An did not relent. They gave instructions that my city should be utterly destroyed. They gave instructions that Urim should be utterly destroyed. An is not one to change his command, and Enlil does not alter what he has uttered. This passage has a quality that is rare in ancient literature. It is a record of a divine decision made over the explicit objection of a lesser divine power. Ningal did not want Ur destroyed. She fought for it before the council twice. She was overruled. The destruction of Ur was not an accident, not a failure of divine attention, not the result of ignorance. It was decided deliberately by the divine assembly against the protests of the goddess who loved the city most. And then they left. Enlil called the storm, the people groan. He brought the storm of abundance away from the land, the people groan. The Anunnaki councils that had decreed the fates of mankind, the assembly that had maintained the cosmic order of the world, issued its final decision regarding the third dynasty of Ur. The storm was released. The cities were destroyed. And the divine patrons of those cities, one by one, withdrew their presence from the empty temples and let the wind fill the spaces where they had been. Mainstream scholarship, represented by Kramer, Michalowski, and more recently Nili Samet in her revised 2014 edition of the Lamentation over the destruction of Ur, reads the city laments as complex theological documents that served a specific political religious function in the immediate aftermath of Ur's fall. The new dynasty of Isin, which succeeded Ur-Thothori, needed to legitimize its authority by explaining the collapse of the previous order not as divine abandonment, but as divine decision, as Enlil's deliberate restructuring of the political landscape which the new Isin dynasty was ordained to fulfill. In this reading, the gods did not truly abandon their cities. They temporarily vacated their temples as a ritualized expression of divine wrath, fully intending to return once the appropriate political order was restored. This is a sound and carefully argued reading. It is supported by the closing passages of several city laments, which include petitions for the gods to return and, in some cases, declarations that the city has been restored. The theological framework of the laments is not one of permanent divine absence, but of cyclical divine recession and return. And yet the pattern the laments describe, the synchronized departure of every major divine patron from every major city in a region, their withdrawal described in the active voice, the world they leave behind described as utterly desolate without them, encodes something that the theological frame does not entirely dissolve. Whether it reflects a specific historical event, a civilizational memory, or a theological truth about what human civilization actually depends on. The image the city laments preserve is indelible, a world of inhabited divine dwellings, suddenly, totally, and irrevocably emptied, breezes haunting sheepfolds where gods once lived. The stones of the temple, the ECSL translation notes, cry out, "Where are you?" Kingship that fell from heaven. In the Ashmolean Museum at the University of Oxford, in a gallery of ancient Near Eastern antiquities, there is a clay prism approximately 20 centimetres tall, inscribed on all four sides with 157 lines of cuneiform text. It was purchased by a collector named Herbert Weld Blundell in 1922 from an antique dealer in Baghdad and donated to the Ashmolean, where it now sits under catalogue number WB444, also cited in scholarship as OECT 2.1. It was inscribed most likely during the reign of Sin Ikisham of Lhasa, approximately 1817-1794 BCE. It is known as the Weld-Blundell prism, and it is the most complete surviving copy of what scholars call the Sumerian King List. The Sumerian King List is not, strictly speaking, a historical document. It is a document that makes a historical argument. The argument is encoded in the text's opening line, which states, in the standard Jacobson translation, when kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This sentence frames everything that follows. Kingship, the right and capacity to govern a human population, did not develop among humans. It came from somewhere else and was placed among humans at a specific time and a specific place. This framing is not incidental. It is the theological premise on which the entire document rests. The King List then records, for each city in succession, the names and reign lengths of its rulers. And here is where the document becomes structurally anomalous in a way that has exercised scholars for generations. The pre-flood kings, the 8 rulers who governed the cities of Sumer before the flood swept over, have reign lengths measured not in years, but in sars, nurs and soses, Sumerian units so large that they produce reign lengths of tens of thousands of years. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, reigned 28,800 years. Alalengar, the second, reigned 36,000 years. Enmengal-Anna reigned 28,800 years. Ensipad-Zid-Anna reigned 36,000 years. Together, the 8 pre-flood kings account for 241,200 years of continuous governance. After the flood, everything changes. The post-flood dynasties, beginning with the first dynasty of Kish, have reign lengths measured in centuries, then in decades. By the time we reach figures we can cross-reference with independent archaeological or historical evidence, the reign lengths have contracted to plausible human lifespans. The transition is not gradual, it is a cliff. Before the flood, tens of thousands of years per reign. After the flood, a few hundred at most, then less. Mainstream scholarship has several well-developed explanations for the pre-flood reign lengths. The Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobson, who edited the Sumerian King List for the Oriental Institute's Assyriological Studies series in 1939, argued that the enormous pre-flood numbers are the result of a scribal tradition of applying astronomical or calendrical units to the early kings as a way of signalling their quasi-divine status, astronomical numbers giving expression to the superhuman character of the early kings. More recently, scholars including Joan Goodnick Westenholz and Pieter Steinkeller have argued that the pre-flood entries are not historical records at all, but theological placeholders, a structured fiction designed to create a deep prehistory for the institution of Sumerian kingship that extended it back to the beginning of organised time. These are credible readings. The King List is clearly a document with a political function, and that function requires a prehistory that is appropriately vast and appropriately divine. What neither explanation fully addresses is the specific rupture the flood represents in the list structure, and what that rupture implies about how the Sumerians understood the nature of governance before and after it. pre-flood kingship, in the list's framing, is characterized by its duration, a single ruler in a single city for 28,000 years or more. This is not human governance. It is not even divine governance in the ordinary Sumerian sense, where gods rotate their favour among cities and new dynasties arise. It is something else, something stable and singular and essentially unchanging across intervals of time that dwarf any human civilization. Post-flood kingship is recognisably human, contested, brief, dynastically fragile, shifting from city to city as the fortunes of war and divine favour rotate. The implicit question the list structure poses, and it does not answer it directly because the list is not that kind of document, is what kind of being could govern a city continuously for 28,000 years? The list's own framing suggests an answer. Beings for whom kingship descended from heaven. Before the flood, those beings were present. After the flood, they were gone. In their place, human kings, carrying delegated authority in brief and mortal spans. The transfer of kingship from its pre-flood form to its post-flood form is, in the language of the king list, precisely the kind of transition from divine to human governance that the me transfer in Inanna and the me describes in miniature, a handover of divine administrative technology from thee. Beings who originally held it to the beings who would maintain it in their absence. The king list does not say what happened to the divine beings whose governance preceded the flood. It simply notes the flood, records the drastically diminished reign lengths that follow it, and continues. The absence speaks as clearly as the text. The older gods and the world below. The Anunnaki do not disappear from the Cuneiform record after the flood, but they change, fundamentally, systematically, and across every civilization that encountered Mesopotamian religious tradition. The direction of the change is consistently downward. The Anunnaki, in the earliest Sumerian sources, are heavenly beings, descendants of An, the sky god, who take up dwellings among the people and decree the fates of mankind from positions of active terrestrial authority. By the later Akkadian period, they have become primarily underworld figures, judges in the realm of the dead, beings associated with subterranean darkness rather than celestial light. And by the time the Hurrian and Hittite traditions encounter the Mesopotamian inheritance, the beings they identify as the Anunnaki are explicitly the former gods, the old generation, banished underground by the new generation that took their place. This trajectory is not a matter of interpretation. It is traceable in the primary sources. The Sumerian text known as Inanna's Descent to the Netherworld, preserved on multiple tablets including CBS 9800, housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and catalogued under the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature as ETCSL 1.4.1, describes Inanna's journey into the underworld to challenge the power of her sister Ereshkigal. The text is one of the most studied in the Sumerian corpus, having been analysed by scholars from Samuel Noah Kramer through Diane Walkstein to the more recent Centennial Survey by Robert Anderson, published on the Intertextual Bible Platform 2022. In the climactic scene of the text, Inanna stands before the judges of the underworld. Those judges are identified as the Anunnaki, 7 of them seated in the Kur, the great below. They look at Inanna, they speak the word of wrath, they condemn her to death. These are not the Anunnaki of Enki and the world order, taking up their dwellings among the people of Sumer. These are underworld judges, beings whose function is death-dealing, whose domain is darkness, whose power operates over the souls of the dead rather than the affairs of the living. The scholar Jeremy Black, in Gods, Demons and Symbols of Ancient Mesopotamia, documents this transformation explicitly. From the Middle Babylonian period onward, the name Anunnaki was applied generally to the deities of the underworld, whereas the name Ijigi was applied to the heavenly deities. The inversion is complete. The beings who once presided over heaven are now associated with the depths of the earth. The Akkadian version of the same text, The Descent of Ishtar into the Underworld, a briefer and somewhat different composition, describes Ereshkigal ordering her servant Namtar to bring the Anunnaki from Egalgina to seat them on golden thrones so they can judge Ishtar. Even in this version, the Anunnaki remain judges in the underworld, powerful, feared, authoritative, but subterranean. Their sovereignty, whatever it once was, now operates exclusively below. The Hurrian and Hittite material completes the arc. Among the Hurrian people of 2nd millennium Anatolia and northern Syria, who absorbed enormous quantities of Mesopotamian religious tradition into their own theological framework, the Anunnaki were identified with an explicitly named class of deities called the Keruliyun. In ancient Hurrian, the phrase means the former ancient gods. An alternative designation in the same texts is Katereyun, the gods of the earth. Both names encode the same theological fact. These are beings who were once supreme and are now underground. Not defeated in the ordinary sense, they are still invoked in Hittite treaties, still called on to witness oaths, still understood as real and powerful. But they are former. They belong to a previous era of divine administration. The Hittite account of how the former gods came to be underground is closely related to Greek narratives of the overthrow of the Titans by the Olympians, a connection the scholar Jan Pouvel documents in detail in his comparative mythology, Johns Hopkins University Press, 1987. In Hittite myth, the oldest generation of gods was banished by the younger generation to the underworld, where they were ruled by the goddess Lelwani. The parallel with Hesiod's theogony is structurally precise. In both traditions, a generational conflict between divine powers results in the imprisonment of the older generation below the earth and the ascension of the younger generation to cosmic sovereignty. In both traditions, the older gods retain power but exercise it from below, in the realm of darkness and the dead. The Hittite scribes, who identified the former ancient gods with the Mesopotamian Anunnaki, were making an explicit interpretive choice. They understood the beings described in the Mesopotamian texts as belonging to the same category as their own banished elder deities, a category defined not by weakness, but by temporal priority. The Anunnaki were not lesser gods. They were earlier ones, gods who had exercised a different kind of authority in a different kind of era, and who had passed from that era into another mode of existence below the surface of the world they had once administered. The convergence of this trajectory across three independent civilizations, Sumerian, Akkadian and Hurro-Hittite, without any of them appearing to have manufactured the pattern collectively, raises a question that the evidence suggests but cannot answer. What happened to a generation of divine beings so consistently, so completely, and across so many independent cultural memories that every civilization that preserved their names preserved also the same essential fact about them, that they used to be here and that now they are not? What the Eridu Genesis remembered first, before the Epic of Gilgamesh told the story of the flood, before the Atrahasis told it, before any of the great Akkadian literary compositions that we have been reading in this investigation were written down, there was a Sumerian text, older, simpler, and now preserved only in fragments, that told the same essential story and framed it in the same essential terms. It is called, in modern scholarship, the Eridu Genesis. Thorkild Jacobson published its definitive translation in the Journal of Biblical Literature in 1981, based on a fragmentary tablet of which approximately 2/3 has been lost. The preserved portions were excavated from an as yet unspecified site, and fragments of the composition are now housed at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The text dates, in its written form, to approximately 1600 BC, though Jacobson and subsequent scholars have argued that the underlying tradition is considerably older, preserved through oral transmission before being committed to clay. What the Eridu Genesis offers that none of the later, more elaborate flood narratives do is simplicity. It is stripped of the literary elaboration, the political theology, and the narrative complexity that characterize the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh versions. It appears to preserve the core structure of the tradition without the overlays that later composers added to serve specific theological or political purposes. And in that stripped-down form, its treatment of the relationship between divine presence and human civilization is, for our investigation, particularly revealing. The Eridu Genesis describes three things in sequence: the creation of humanity by the gods, the institution of kingship, and the flood. The creation passage is largely lost to damage. The kingship passage is brief but structurally significant. It describes the gods descending to lower the institutions of civilization, kingship, the sacred offices, the architectural templates for temples and cities to humanity. The verb used in Jacobson's translation implies movement from above to below, from a divine realm to a human one. The institutions of civilization are not discovered or developed by humans, they are lowered to them, the way you lower something on a rope from a height. And then the flood comes. A single tablet fragment preserves the crucial passage, in which Ziusudra, the Sumerian name for the flood survivor, is described as a king and lustration priest who had been receiving communications from the gods through the walls of a reed structure. The flood arrives. Ziusudra survives in his vessel, and the preserved text ends, after its damaged lacunae, with Ziusudra being granted immortality by Ananenlil and being sent to dwell in a land overseas, the land of Dilmun, the Sumerian paradise, located somewhere at the edge of the known world, like Utnapishtim at the mouth of the rivers. The Eridu Genesis does not describe what happens to the gods after the flood. Its surviving text does not give us the council debates, the divine arguments, the weeping and cowering of the Gilgamesh version. What it does give us is the oldest surviving textual statement of the pre-flood, post-flood structure that we have traced throughout this investigation. Before the flood, kingship was lowered from heaven to humanity. After the flood, the human survivor of the flood is elevated, placed outside the world of ordinary human existence in a land overseas, separated from the civilization that now inherits the institutions that were lowered to it. The trajectory in the Eridu Genesis is clearly legible. The gods lower their administrative institutions to humanity. The flood breaks the original arrangement. The survivor of the flood is removed from ordinary human existence. And the world that comes after the flood, where, as the Sumerian king list shows, reign lengths contract from tens of thousands of years to human scales, is the world without the original administrators. A world that has inherited the tools of civilization, but not the beings who originally held them. What makes the Eridu Genesis important for our larger argument is not any single detail it contains, but its chronological position in the tradition. The pattern we have been tracing, the withdrawal of divine presence, the transfer of authority to human hands, the flood as a rupture point, the diminished post-flood world, is not a late development. It is not a theological innovation of the Neo-Babylonian period or the Neo-Assyrian. It is present in the oldest surviving layer of the Sumerian written tradition, encoded before the great literary compositions that would elaborate and enrich it over the following 1,000 years. This means the pattern is not a product of the tradition's later sophistication. It is the tradition's original core. Every subsequent text that touches on the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity, every lament, every epic, every legal prologue, every royal inscription that invokes when kingship descended from heaven is, in some sense, a commentary on what the Eridu Genesis stated first. The gods gave civilization to humanity. Something happened. The gods were no longer in the same relationship to the world they had given, and the world went on carrying what had been given to it without entirely understanding where it came from. The clay tablet that preserves the Eridu Genesis is approximately 4,000 years old, approximately 2/3 of it is gone. What remains is enough to outline the argument. What is missing may be where the most specific answers were. This too is part of the pattern. 3 ways to read the same stone. We have now moved through a substantial portion of the cuneiform record on this question, from the Labour Rebellion in Atra-Hassis to the flood of Tablet C, from the war among the gods in the Neo-Assyrian text to the synchronized departure of divine patrons in the city laments, from the reign-length rupture in the Sumerian king list to the transformation of the Anunnaki from heavenly governors to underworld judges across 3 independent civilizations. It is time to do something that honest investigation requires, to present, without advocacy, the full range of scholarly and interpretive frameworks through which this body of evidence can be understood. Because the evidence does not speak in a single voice, and the question of what it means depends entirely on the framework through which you approach it. There are 3 principal frameworks. The first is the framework of theology and symbol. In this reading, championed by scholars including Thorkild Jacobson in the Treasures of Darkness Yale University Press, 1976, and extended by subsequent generations of Assyriology, the Anunnaki and their apparent withdrawal from earthly presence encode a sophisticated philosophical, theological understanding of the human condition. The withdrawal of the gods is not a literal historical event. It is a mythological expression of the distance between humanity and the divine, a statement about the fundamental inaccessibility of ultimate cosmic order to ordinary human experience. The gods are not gone because they left. They are experienced as gone because human beings, by their nature, cannot continuously perceive the divine presence that nevertheless sustains the world. The flood, in this reading, is not a rupture in a literal divine administration. It is a symbol of the primordial catastrophe that created the world as we know it, the separation of cosmic perfection from human imperfection, the origin of the gap between what the world is and what we feel it ought to be. This reading is intellectually serious and textually grounded. Jacobson's analysis of Sumerian religious psychology, his tracing of the movement in Mesopotamian theology from an early numinous religion of cosmic forces to a later personal religion of individual divine relationship, provides a coherent framework within which the apparent departure of the Anunnaki can be understood as a theological development rather than a historical event. The gods did not leave. The relationship between humanity and the divine evolved, and the evolution was experienced as abandonment. This is not a dismissal of the texts. It is a reading that takes them seriously as literature. The second framework is the one that might be called encoded wisdom, the reading that understands the Anunnaki narratives not as theology in the conventional sense, but as philosophical or esoteric teaching encoded in mythological form. In this reading, the me represent not divine administrative technologies, literally handed down from above, but the accumulated wisdom traditions of a civilization, the sum of what a society must know to maintain itself. The departure of the Anunnaki encodes the insight that the living transmission of wisdom requires a carrier, and that when the carriers are gone, only the record remains. The city laments in this reading are not about divine beings literally vacating temples. They are about the loss of a living tradition, the moment when accumulated knowledge becomes historical document rather than active practice, when the wisdom that once animated a civilization becomes an object of scholarly study rather than a living capacity. This reading also has serious scholarly precedent, though it is more commonly found in the work of historians of ideas than in strict Assyriology. The philosopher and historian Henri Frankfurt, in Kingship and the Gods, University of Chicago Press, 1948, argued that the Mesopotamian understanding of kingship as a divine institution reflected a deep insight into the nature of social order, that legitimate governance derives its authority from something beyond mere force or consent, from a principle of cosmic rightness that human beings can embody but cannot originate. The descent of kingship from heaven in the Sumerian king list is, in this reading, a statement about the metaphysics of authority. It comes from beyond the human, or it is not genuine. When the divine origin is lost, the authority degrades. The shorter reign lengths of the post-flood kings are not a historical record. They are a statement about what happens to human governance when it loses contact with the deeper source that once sustained it. The third framework is the one this investigation has been gently circling without forcing a conclusion: the historical memory reading. In this framework, which is explicitly speculative and which no mainstream Assyriologist currently advocates, though some archaeologists and historians of early civilization take its premises seriously as research questions, the pattern of divine presence, conflict and withdrawal documented in the cuneiform sources reflects a genuine cultural memory of historical events whose nature remains unclear. Not gods in the theological sense, not metaphors, something else, beings or a class of beings who exercised some form of direct administrative or technological authority over early Mesopotamian civilization, whose presence is documented in the oldest layers of the textual tradition, who were involved in internal conflict that is recorded, with unusual specificity in multiple independent texts, and who at some point ceased to be present in the way they had been, leaving behind them a civilization that continued to function using the tools and institutions they had created, guided by records of their existence preserved in clay. This reading faces serious evidentiary obstacles, and intellectual honesty requires stating them plainly. No physical evidence of non-human advanced beings has been identified in any Mesopotamian excavation. The impossible reign lengths of the pre-flood kings are far more easily explained by the Jacobson astronomical unit theory than by any literal interpretation. The transformation of the Anunnaki from heavenly to underworld figures tracks precisely with developments in Babylonian political theology that have clear historical explanations, and the entire framework of the historical memory reading rests on a methodological assumption that mythological texts can preserve literal historical information across millennia without significant distortion, that mainstream historiography has excellent reasons to treat with caution, and yet the consistency of the pattern across independent traditions remains. The Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis, the Gilgamesh Flood, the City Laments, the King List, the Poem of Error, the Neo-Assyrian War Text and the Horo-Hittite identification of the former ancient gods with the Anunnaki are not all drawing on the same source. They are independent witnesses to the same structural fact in the textual record that the beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki were once described as present in one way and are later described as present in a completely different way, reduced, removed, relegated to the depths. And the transition between these two descriptions is consistently associated across all the sources with conflict, loss and catastrophe. Whether that consistency reflects a single historical truth, a single deep theological insight, or a single foundational cultural memory that successive civilizations inherited and elaborated differently, this is not a question the clay tablets can answer for us. They can only present the evidence. The reading is ours. What remains if they are gone? Let us stay for a moment in the speculative register. Let us take the third framework, the historical memory reading, seriously, not as a conclusion, but as a thought experiment in the tradition of philosophical inquiry that asks, if this interpretation has merit, then what follows? If the cuneiform source is preserved in the compressed and encoded language of myth and theology, a genuine cultural memory of a class of beings who once administered early human civilization and then, following a conflict or series of conflicts that the texts describe with unusual specificity, withdrew from that administration, then what does that imply for the questions we ask about the origins of Sumerian civilization itself? Because there is adjacent to the textual evidence we have been examining, an archaeological puzzle that has generated considerable scholarly discussion and no fully satisfying resolution. The Sumerian civilization that appears in the archaeological record around 3500–3000 BC does not appear with a developmental arc that corresponds to what we would expect from a purely endogenous emergence. Other early civilizations, early Egypt, early China, early Mesoamerica, show clear, traceable developmental stages, simple villages becoming more complex settlements, becoming urban centres, with tool technologies, agricultural practices and administrative systems evolving gradually across centuries. The Sumerian record shows something different. The cities appear with considerable administrative complexity relatively early. The writing system that emerges from the Uruk period is not simple pictography developing toward greater abstraction in the way that purely indigenous writing systems tend to develop. It appears from its very earliest stages to function as a system designed for a specific purpose, the recording of large-scale administrative information, inventories, accounts, allocations, labour records. Samuel Noah Kramer in The Sumerians identified first attributed to Sumerian civilization that collectively read like a complete kit for running a complex society, the first schools, the first legal codes, the first written literature, the first pharmacopoeia, the first cosmogony, the first agricultural almanac, the first libraries. Kramer was not arguing for divine origin when he compiled this list. He was documenting the breadth of Sumerian achievement. But the breadth he documented is precisely what the historical memory reading would predict. A civilization that received a complete administrative system, rather than developing one incrementally, would show exactly this kind of precocious, broad-spectrum complexity. The Sumerian Abgal, translated variously as sages, wise men, or the seven sages, appear in cuneiform sources including the Poem of Error and various ritual texts as a class of beings associated specifically with the transmission of the me before and during the flood period. In the Poem of Error, Marduk describes them as seven sages of the depths, those sacred fish, who like Ea their lord are perfect in sublime wisdom, the ones who cleansed my person. They are associated in the texts with the cities of Eridu, the oldest Sumerian city, and with the god Enki, the craftsman god, the god of wisdom, the god who repeatedly intervenes to preserve humanity from the decisions of the divine council. The Abgal are not gods. They are not quite human. They are described as beings who carried specific knowledge from the pre-flood world into the post-flood world, who transmitted the foundations of civilization across the rupture of the flood. Whether the Abgal are theological constructions, records of a priestly or scholarly class, encoded memories of actual knowledge keepers, or something else entirely, the texts do not say. What the texts say is that specific knowledge, originating from a specific divine source, was transmitted by specific beings at a specific historical moment. The knowledge survived. The beings who brought it are, in the later texts, gone. The implications of this, if the historical memory reading has merit, extend to every assumption we make about the origins of human civilization. If the Sumerians were not the inventors of the administrative, mathematical, astronomical and legal systems they possessed, but the inheritors and preservers of a knowledge base transmitted from an earlier source, then the question of human origins becomes considerably more open than the conventional developmental model suggests. Not necessarily in the direction of extraterrestrial beings, which is where popular imagination typically goes, and which the cuneiform sources themselves do not support in any direct way, but in the direction of a deep prehistory that the present state of archaeology has not yet fully illuminated, of a world before the world we know, in which forms of organisation, knowledge and authority existed that we have not accounted for in our standard models of human development. This is, to be clear, a suggestion, a question. The evidence from which it emerges is real. The conclusion to which it points is not established. The distinction between these two things is the one this investigation has tried throughout its length to preserve. The cuneiform record says The Anunnaki were here, they were present, they administered, they fought, they left. The record says all of this across multiple independent sources, from multiple periods, from multiple civilizations that inherited the same essential memory. What we do with that consistency is ultimately a matter of interpretive choice. The clay does not force our hand, it only holds its testimony unchanged for whoever comes next to read it, the question the clay still carries. We began in the British Museum, in a basement corridor, in low light, in the specific silence that surrounds objects that have been kept for a very long time. The tablet K3375, the flood tablet, lying in its padded tray with its catalogue number inked in careful script along the edge, cold clay, 4,000 years old, small enough to hold in one hand. George Smith held it in 1872 and recognised something that made him leave the building and remove his jacket on a London street in December. What he recognised was not just the flood story, it was the gap, the place in the narrative where something had been and was no longer where the gods, those terrifying and weeping and cowering beings who crouched against the wall of heaven while the waters rose, were described making a settlement with the world they had nearly destroyed, drawing a new boundary between their realm and the human one, sending the survivor to the mouth of the rivers at the edge of everything known. Whatever George Smith felt standing on that street, it was the feeling of something very old pressing through very thin clay. We have read, tonight, from 11 texts spanning more than 1,000 years of cuneiform tradition. We have read the Labour Rebellion of the Igigi and the creation of humans in Atrahasis. We have read Marduk's own words in the poem of Error, when I left my dwelling, the regulation of heaven and earth disintegrated. We have read the City Laments, those extraordinary documents in which every divine patron of every Sumerian city is described abandoning their dwelling in the same moment, letting the breezes haunt their empty temples. We have read the Sumerian king list's silent rupture between the impossible reign lengths before the flood and the human ones after it. We have read the Neo-Assyrian war tablet in which the Anunnaki take prisoners and Ninosag pleads, "Let this not happen again." We have read the Hurrian names, Karule-Ayun, the former ancient gods. The pattern these sources describe is consistent. It is not manufactured by selecting convenient passages and ignoring inconvenient ones. The full textual record contains the same trajectory, and the mainstream scholarly frameworks that explain that trajectory in theological and political terms are not wrong. They may simply be incomplete. The theology and the history, the symbol and the memory, the metaphor and the event, these are not always separate things. Sometimes a civilization encodes what actually happened in the language it uses to describe what is always happening, and the two levels of meaning reinforce each other across centuries until it becomes impossible to cleanly separate them. What the cuneiform sources preserve, at minimum, is this: a civilization that believed it had received its knowledge, its governance, its identity as a civilization from beings who were no longer present in the way they once had been. A civilization that encoded that absence in its theology, its literature, its lamentations, its administrative documents, and its lists of kings. A civilization that remembered, in the formula it returned to again and again, when kingship descended from heaven, that the authority it exercised was not, in the deepest sense, its own. It had been given. It had been inherited. The givers were gone. Whether those givers were cosmic principles, theological constructions, encoded memories of a human administrative class, or something that our current vocabulary of history and archaeology does not yet have adequate words for, the clay tablets do not tell us. They describe the fact of the departure. They record the war that preceded it, the flood that accompanied it, the emptied temples that followed it. They note, with a thoroughness that becomes moving when you read enough of them, the breezes that entered the sacred spaces where the gods had been. They ask, in the voice of Ningal standing outside the ruined walls of Ur, "Where can I sit? Where can I stand?" The texts do not answer, they only carry the question forward. From the Sumerian temple libraries of Nippur and Eridu, through the burning palace of Nineveh, through the Oxford vitrine where the Weld Blundell prism stands, and through the padded trays of the British Museum basement, to wherever you are tonight, in whatever light you have chosen, in whatever quiet you have found. The question the clay carries is not, where did the Anunnaki go? That is the popular version of the question, and the popular version is too specific for what the evidence actually gives us. The real question is gentler and stranger and more interesting than that. It is the one that Tablet C of the Epic of Gilgamesh ends on, when Utnapishtim says to Gilgamesh, "I will tell you a secret of the gods." The secret is not the flood, though the flood is what follows. The secret is that there is a secret, that the world as it is now is not the world as it has always been, and that the gap between those two worlds is where the real history lives, in the clay that remembers what the historians have not yet fully learnt to read. You have heard this evidence tonight. You have sat with the tablets in their cases, the laments in their numbered Kirugu sections, the broken colophon of Kaptialani Marduk, who wrote down what he received in a dream. You have followed the Anunnaki from the temples of Sumer, through the flood, into the underworld, through the names the Hurrians gave them, former, ancient, of the earth below. What you make of it is yours. No transcript of these investigations, however careful, can hand you a conclusion that the sources themselves decline to make. What the clay carries is an open question. It has been open for 4,000 years. Let your body rest now. Let the images settle, the low corridor, the padded trays, the baked clay, the colour of old sand. Let the names dissolve, Nana, Enlil, Era, Marduk, the seven who urged the restless god to rise. Let the cities dissolve, Nippur, Eridu, Uruk, the E-Kur and the E-Kishnu-Gal, and the Agrunkug, where Ningal said she could find no peace. Let even the question dissolve, gently, into the quiet that has always been underneath it. The tablets will be there tomorrow, in their padded trays, in their controlled light, in their 40 centuries of patient, unremarked waiting. They do not need your answer tonight. They have been waiting longer than answers take. If tonight's investigation stayed with you, if these sources and their quiet implications found a place in your thoughts, leave a word where you're resting. The tradition of noting presence, of marking the fact of being in a specific place at a specific hour with a specific question in mind, is older than writing. It might be the oldest tradition of all. The breezes have haunted the sheepfold long enough. Sleep well.